Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our symposium on the biology of sex differences. We're so excited to have everybody here today. We're especially grateful to our virtual audience. About 300 of you are tuning in from various places around the world, and we are so excited to have you here today. This event is co-hosted by the NSU College of Psychology and the Society for Neurosports. I would like to mention that the Society for Neurosports will have our next huge, amazing conference. It's going to be right here in Florida on Hollywood Beach. That's going to be on January 20th and 21st. Please head to neurosports.net to read more about that. Today, we're going to have the symposium on the biology of sex differences. We understand that studying sex differences is particularly important for the application and a stronger understanding of sex differences in healthcare for equity and delivery. Today, we're going to learn about why it's critical how sex differences through organizational, activational, and chromosome effects affect various aspects of health and performance. I'm so excited to talk to you about the speakers that are going to be presenting today. Our first speaker, who is also our keynote speaker, is Dr. Valerie Sterrett. Dr. Sterrett is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology here at NSU. She is an evolutionary psychologist with broad interest in human mating and sexual conflict. From mate value, mate guarding, and infidelity to intimate partner violence, sexual coercion, and rape. Dr. Sterrett's research incorporates a combination of basic biometric, psychometric, and behavioral assessments. Our next speaker will be Dr. Craddock. Dr. Travis Craddock is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience, Computer Science, and Clinical Immunology at Nova Southeastern University. He also serves as the director of Clinical Systems Biology Group at NSU's Institute for Neuroimmune Medicine. He applies computational systems biology approach and biophysics methods towards the purpose of identifying novel treatments for complex chronic illnesses involving neuroinflammation. Our third speaker today is going to be Dr. Allison Brager. Dr. Brager is a major in the U.S. Army and a neurobiologist with expertise in sleep and chronobiology. She sits on the Federal Fatigue Management Working Group and has contributed to Army doctrine on holistic health and fitness through the Office Surgeon General. In addition, Dr. Brager consults with the U.S. Olympic, collegiate, and professional sporting teams. Dr. Brager was also recently selected as a NASA astronaut applicant. Finally, our last speaker today is going to be Dr. Jose Antonio, who's an associate professor in the Exercise and Sports Science program here at NSU. His research interests focus on the role of sports nutrition vis-a-vis athletic performance and body composition. He's an expert in the role of high-protein diets on health and body composition. Dr. Antonio is also the CEO and co-founder of the International Society of Sports Nutrition. So help me in welcoming all of our speakers today. And our first speaker, Dr. Valerie Sterrett.
So I get to be here today to sort of set the stage and just get us all on the same page and understanding what it is we're actually talking about when we're talking about sex differences. And when we're talking about sex differences, really all we're doing is acknowledging the statement that women and men are different. Now, when people say this, they mean a lot of different things. When people say women and men are different, they can mean all sorts of stuff. When we say women and men are different, all we're really doing is acknowledging the fact that humans are a sexually dimorphic species. And what this means is that there are two general forms that an adult person can take, two different paths of development to get two different bodies. One of those bodies that is built by and for ovaries, and another body that is built by and for testes. Now, every individual typically developing human has all of the genes, most of the genes they need to build either one of these. Now, if this is what you have, right, you've got both of these sets of genes to build ovaries and build testes. The default form is one where the ovary building genes suppress the testy building genes, and you get the development of ovaries, which then produce ova or eggs, and also produce comparatively massive amounts of estradiol or estrogen, right? Now, if you don't have this, let's say you've got something else. You've got both of these sets of genes, but you also have an SRY gene. The sex determining region of the Y chromosome typically only shows up on Y chromosomes, can occasionally show up other places. I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that later. But if you've got this extra gene, if you've got this SRY gene, what happens is that this gene suppresses the ovary building genes. And so you ultimately get the testes building genes doing their job, which then produces testes, and the testes produce sperm and a whole lot of testosterone, right? Now, this is really important when we're talking about sex differences in general, because this is where a lot of our sex differences start. You notice here that my little graphic for eggs and my little graphic for sperm are vastly different sizes. This isn't even close to the real size difference, by the way. The real size difference is astronomically large. But this is important because this difference in investment in ova versus sperm is really, really big. How big do we mean here? So if we look at bodies that are building eggs versus bodies that are building sperm, there's a huge difference in the amount of sort of energetic investment that has to be put into building either one of those different kinds of gametes. And so we see here that if we look at it in terms of basal metabolic rate, sort of just the amount of energy that your body has to expend just sort of existing, not really doing much else. We see that bodies that are building ovaries and eggs have to expend about 300% of their basal metabolic rate on building those gametes. On the other hand, we've got bodies that are building sperm only have to, and if you consider sperm plus all the ejaculate fluids that have to be there to make the sperm useful, you're getting a basal metabolic rate spent on that of about 0.04%. So if we do that math, what that means is that the energetic cost of gamete biomass production, whether you're building eggs or building sperm, is 3 orders of magnitude higher for females. Again, that really means that females are investing 1,000 times the metabolic energy in producing gametes than males are. That's a big difference, but we're not done there. If we consider just the overall amount of investment that a female has to invest in order to successfully reproduce compared to males, we don't get to stop there, because females don't get to stop there, the amount that they have to invest just to be able to successfully reproduce. So let's say that one of those eggs becomes a viable pregnancy. If you want that female body to take that one pregnancy, say a healthy pregnancy, all the way to term, and let's say you want the kid to survive after that, so you add, say, 6 months of lactation top of that, the metabolic equivalent of that, say the 14 months it takes to gestate and feed offspring, you're looking at the equivalent of running about 60 marathons in 14 months. We're not done yet, though, because once she does all of that, she also then is giving up 100% of her, at least over the short term, 100% of her opportunities for additional mating. Once she's mated successfully, she can't mate again until some amount of time has passed. So it doesn't matter if she's already successfully mated. If the perfect mate comes along after that, it's useless to her. It doesn't matter. I mean, the absolute perfect mate could come along. If she's already mated, she's done for a while. She can't do anything about it. But we're not done yet because she also then has to, of course, there is a pregnancy and birth and all of that stuff. She's risking illness and death, right? So this is a lot that she has to invest. Now, males, on the other hand, are almost done with just the building the comparatively cheap sperm that they have to build. I mean, the only really thing you have to do after that is you've got to get the ejaculate where it needs to be. So essentially, he's got to have sex, which estimates say that having sex for men is metabolically about the equivalent of doing light housework. So this means that we can have 2 people, one man and one woman, looking at the exact same situation, one sexual encounter, one potential sexual encounter. She is literally risking death. He is risking the equivalent of, a couple minutes doing the dishes, maybe vacuuming if he's like really into it, right? So this really means that women and men are different. Women and men are different. Say, okay, so that's what it takes for reproduction. But what does that get us, say, in down the road differences, right? We know those bodies have to be different in order to create those differences, right? So we can look at, say, differences in, say, some basic biometric features. between men and women. And look at the size difference here. If we look at post-pubertal testosterone levels, remember testosterone produced by those testes that only people generally with the SRY gene have, that this size difference, if we look at, say, a Cohen's D score, that's 16.6. That's huge. We generally put the cap at calling something a large difference at 0.08. So 16.6 is just astronomical. That means if you look at the general population of humanity and you randomly select one man and randomly select one woman from the general population of humanity, there is 100% chance that he's got a higher testosterone level than her. On the other hand, if you look at estrogen levels, there's almost 100% chance that she is going to have a higher estrogen level than him. He's also substantially more likely to have more muscle mass and to be taller. Now, okay, fine, but let's also consider the fact that testosterone is a performance-enhancing drug. So then we would expect that men and women would be different on metrics of performance. And we see exactly that there are huge differences between men and women on some metrics of, say, athletic performance. If we, again, randomly select one typically developing man and randomly select one typically developing woman from the general population of humanity, what we've got is that he's got about a 97% chance of having a higher hand grip strength than her. There's also a greater than 90% chance that he's going to be able to throw a ball farther than her and harder than her. Now, there is a substantial chance that she's actually going to be more resistant to muscle fatigue than he is, which is probably one of the reasons why we see women performing comparatively well in, say, endurance sports. But let's say we've got a woman who doesn't like that idea, Dr. Tarter. And so we have a woman who's determined to become as strong as a man. She wants to be as strong as possible. Can she do it? If she really, really, really works hard, if she absolutely does everything she can to be as strong as a man, can she do it? I'm sorry, Dr. Tarter, you cannot. So if we say take one general population man, right, and then we select at random one elite female athlete, a woman who has spent her entire life dedicating herself to being as big and strong and as athletic as possible, there's still a huge difference there. So if we compare that one average randomly selected male and one elite female athlete, there's still a greater than 80% chance that he's going to have a greater hand grip strength than her. In fact, greater than 90% of men are going to be stronger in terms of hand grip strength than the average elite female athlete. And let's say we take the absolute strongest elite female athlete that we have, right? She's still only going to be about as strong as the average man. And if you want to see what this looks like in real life, I'd suggest talking to Dr. Brager over here, who, again, in addition to being a neuroscientist and a major in the Army, is herself an elite female athlete who has relatively recently completed the Army combat fitness test and scored essentially as high as it is physically possible for a woman to perform. And as a consequence of that, she gets to be recognized as an average soldier. Yeah, boo to that, I know. Okay, so what if we take that somewhere beyond just a physical body, right? I mean, could we have some of these sex differences in basic sort of metabolic differences and the performance differences? Are there going to be some other psychological differences, some other behavioral differences? Well, one place we would expect to see that, I mean, given the whole any one sexual encounter, she's risking death, he's risking doing the dishes, we would expect to see some differences in what men and women look for in a potential mate. Now, there's lots of things that people look for in a potential mate, and everybody wants somebody who's nice and kind and all that, and that's great. But we do see some substantial sex differences in some of these variables. So we see if you, again, select one randomly selected woman and one randomly selected man from the general population of humanity, you see that she is substantially more likely, when looking for a potential mate, to care about his earning potential, his ambition, whereas he is moderately more likely to care about how physically attractive she is. Now, I'm not going to say much more on this because if I start talking about it, I won't stop for 3 days. So I'm going to leave that there. But what I will do is move on and acknowledge the fact that not everybody isn't one thing, right? We're not just one variable. We're not just our earning potential or just our ambition. We are lots of things. So David Buss has originally identified 19 different traits along which men and women look for different things in a potential partner. And so what happens if we look at all of these differences together? So instead of taking a univariate approach and just looking at one variable or another, we take a multivariate approach and look at, say, pattern differences. Are there sex differences in the patterns with which people look for any of these traits in a potential partner? Huge differences. So if we look at the overall pattern of differences, we take this multivariate approach, look at the overall pattern of differences and what someone looks for in a potential mate, we see only a 22.8% overlap in what men and women look for overall in a potential mate, which again is not surprising considering she's risking death and he's not. Now, we also can do the math here and we can use this and say that if we take all of this that we know about someone's mate preferences, and if we only know that about them, say we pick a random person out of the general population and we know absolutely nothing about that person except what they look for in a potential mate, we can predict that person's sex with greater than 92% accuracy. We can't predict anything with 92% accuracy. Imagine if we could predict the weather with 92% accuracy, what we'd be able to do. These are huge differences. Okay, fine, it's directly related to mating, so of course we'd expect to see some differences there, but what happens if we take it a little further back? Take another step away from basic biology. Let's talk about personality differences. Now again, when we look at individual univariate measures, we look at one metric at a time, we do see some differences here. You again take one randomly selected man and one randomly selected woman from the general population of humanity. You see that she's substantially more likely to demonstrate sensitivity, be more sensitive as a person. She's moderately more likely to be more apprehensive, maybe score a little on warmth. He's slightly more likely to score higher on measures of dominance or privacy, negligible differences beyond that. But if you, again, take a multivariate approach and look at the sum total of a person's personality measures, we only see a 10% overlap between men and women. There's only a 10% overlap between men and women on global measures of personality. Okay, fine, but maybe there's some practical differences. Does this extend to something practical? Well, okay, let's look at, say, vocational interests. Does maybe this have some relationship to what kind of job a person wants to take? Seems that there might be, right? So we have, say, again, one randomly selected man, one randomly selected woman from the general population of humanity. We see that he is substantially more likely to be interested in doing a job that involves doing things, a kind of hands-on job. He is also slightly more likely to be interested in a job that involves thinking, organizing, persuading people, think lawyer. She's slightly more likely to be interested in a job that involves helping people. Overall, she's substantially more likely to be interested in a job that is people-oriented. That is not me. I don't like people. But again, if we look at the global perspective here in terms of vocational interests, we again only see a 27% overlap between men and women in terms of what kinds of jobs they're interested in. But maybe there's something beyond this, right? Well, let's say we take one man and one woman and put them in the same job. They get to the same job, right? And for fun, let's make it a job where physical size and strength is wholly irrelevant to any of it. Let's say, I don't know, university faculty member. Are there maybe differences in the actual work that men and women are doing while in that ostensibly same job? Seems that there is. Women are moderately more likely. So if you have one male faculty member, one female faculty member in the same job, she's moderately more likely to have been asked to take on additional work that week compared to him. She's more likely, slightly more likely to spend more time mentoring student research. She's more likely greater number of student research projects to mentor, whereas he is slightly to moderately more likely to be spending time advancing his own research. So it seems that even when we have men and women in the same job, they're not necessarily actually doing the same job. Okay, fine. But I mean, would we expect that to maybe translate to, say, differences on a practical level in terms of, I don't know, compensation? Seems so. That if you take sort of a variety of different jobs that men and women could engage in,
with the same degree and the same vocation, it seems that generally across the board, he is more likely to get paid more than her. Okay, fine. There could be an argument that maybe he's just better at it. So maybe men are just better at jobs, and so that's where this increase in likelihood of getting higher compensation comes from. So we can, in fact, look at, are there sex differences in job performance? Okay, so again, let's stick with a job where physical size and strength is irrelevant, but let's move away from university faculty here and say go to physicians. So what if we look at physicians and compare male physicians to female physicians in terms of their performance on the job and how much they're likely to get paid? Now, generally, there's not huge differences here between how male physicians perform and how female physicians perform. She is moderately more likely to score better on some practical assessments of physician fitness to practice. Not really any difference in terms of, say, physician knowledge tests. He is nominally more likely to have patients die or readmitted into the hospital, but he is slightly more likely to get paid more than her. It has been argued that one of the reasons that we see the sex difference in pay when we don't see sex differences in performance, because she seems to be busy outside of work. If you just look at, say, married female physicians, you see that she is, compared to him, the other male married physician, she's more likely to have additional, say, household duties compared to him. So it seems that men and women are not necessarily doing the same jobs or getting compensated for the same jobs in a variety of different fields. So, okay, this is all fine, everything. But when I started, I promised I was going to talk about what sexual dimorphism in humans is, what it is, what it isn't, and why it matters. So I hope I've at least started to get us there. But just to sum up, in case I didn't do my job well, what it is, sexual dimorphism in humans is a consequence of evolutionary pressures that results in biologically based differences of various effect sizes in a wide range of physiological, psychological, and behavioral variables between people who live in bodies that have been masculinized and people who live in bodies that have not been or have been less masculinized. That's what it is. What it isn't is simple. It's not a simple thing. When we say men and women are different, people want there to be a sweeping statement about that. It's not a simple thing. It's also not a value judgment, which is the other thing that people tend to think it is. When we say that men and women are different, we are not saying men or women are better. We're saying that they're different. If we decide to treat them differently or value them differently, that's a different decision that we're making. That's not just what sex differences are. That's a whole nother decision that we've decided to make. And why it matters. I mean, just think about everything that does matter. Think about every medical treatment, every law, every policy, every institutional practice that could be relevant to these things that we're talking about here. That's why it matters. So it's important to all of us for people to continue to do this kind of research, to really start to better understand what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about sex differences. And we're going to have some of those very talented researchers come up here and tell us a little bit more about these sex differences as soon as I stop talking. So to that end, thank you very much. And on to the next. Questions? Yeah. No, that's sum total. So that's sum total, a body that builds eggs versus a body that builds sperm. How much of that basal metabolic rate is contributing to building just those gametes? Doesn't have to do with anything else. It's just the gametes themselves, just the eggs, just the sperm, or in the case of men, sperm plus all the ejaculate fluid and everything that requires to make that sperm valuable. Yes. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So it's a good question. We don't know quite as much about non-heterosexual relationships and preferences as we do heterosexual relationships and preferences. But really, we get back to the idea of the extent to which the body that has those preferences has been masculinized. That's really what it gets down to. So when you have a body that has been masculinized, you have a body that hasn't been masculinized. That's really where we start to see those big differences. And we do tend to see that there are basic hormonal differences generally between people who identify as heterosexual and people who identify as non-heterosexual. But that does bring me to one other point that may be relevant here that I didn't have time to talk about. But when I talk about masculinization, there's actually two different ways that a body can be masculinized. There's the physique, the actual physical form, what you see when you look at a person, but then we also have neural masculinization. It actually is a different critical period. So when you get masculinization of a physical body, that happens at a separate time in development compared to masculinization of the brain, which is really the seat of all these preferences that we're talking about. So that would make a difference too. I know I sort of side-skirted your question, but thanks for letting me do that. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies. So this question was about, hopefully you got the gist of the question from my answer to it, about differences between heterosexual versus non-heterosexual mate preferences. And the first question was about the metabolic sex differences in gamete production, sort of whether that's just during a certain time or sort of a global difference. Okay. No, the statistics that I showed were controlling for all variables relevant to that. So controlling for specialty, controlling for baseline patient health metrics, all of those things. Damn it. Sorry. The question was, if you're looking at, say, male and female physicians, would it make a difference in terms of the particular specializations, the specific specialties that male or female physicians take on? Can I be done now, or are there more questions? I'd like to be done now. No, we're good.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me here to speak today. I'm not going to be going into quite as much detail on sex differences as Dr. Sturrat, but I'm going to be talking more about the application of sex differences in finding treatment courses for complex neuroinflammatory illnesses. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about Gulf War illness and some of the work that we've been doing here at the Institute for Neuroimmune Medicine. So for those of you that don't know, Gulf War illness is a complex chronic neuroinflammatory illness that's resulting from the 1990-1991 Gulf War conflict. About a third of the troops returning from that conflict came back with unexplained symptoms. So chronic fatigue, musculoskeletal pain, gastrointestinal pain, brain fog, joint pain, and so forth. The actual etiology and what the cause of that is not quite known. What is believed is that it's due to a low-grade exposure to a nerve toxic agent, particularly sarin, after the demolition of a munitions plant in the region, and that gas wafted across the entire troops. And due to the stress of the wartime environment and exposure to that agent, it resulted in these symptoms. Now, they've invested about $1 billion into Gulf War illness health since the inception of the war, the end of the war. But no treatment has been found for this illness, and we're still trying to understand what it is that caused this illness. So we need to make progress on this. But one of the main problems with this illness is the vast heterogeneity in the presentation. So you can imagine that if someone comes back and they meet certain criteria for the illness, such as brain fog, cognitive problems, and gastrointestinal issues, and then you have another person that comes back and they have the brain fog, but they have musculoskeletal pain and fatigue, that those two people will probably have a different underlying biology that's giving rise to that presentation. And because of that, when you're trying to compare these two individuals, you're going to get vastly different results, especially if you're using the same sort of assays over and over and over again. So one of the things that we've decided to do is to better characterize these illnesses is to subtype them. So look for specific groups of these people with these illnesses and see if those more similar groups have better symptom presentation or better underlying biology or better described underlying biology that gives rise to these symptoms. So the first avenue that we looked at is post-traumatic stress disorder. So considering that we're dealing with a military population, these individuals coming back are likely to have either been exposed to traumatic events or experienced traumatic events, and that these can. Okay. So I need to see the screen though. So they're going to be likely to have experienced a traumatic event, which can give rise to post-traumatic stress. Now, post-traumatic stress disorder is characterized by distressing memories, so recurrent thoughts about the traumatic event, avoidance of things that remind you of the event, hyperarousal, always being vigilant of things that may be reminiscent of the event, causing you to avoid that. Additionally, there are underlying biological differences in individuals that have post-traumatic stress disorder versus those that don't. So they tend to have higher cortisol levels as well as different responses in immunity. It's estimated that about 12% of the vets returning from the Gulf War have PTSD, but that's all of the vets that are coming back. Now, if you look at the individuals that have Gulf War illness, that increases up to about 35%. So now the post-traumatic stress disorder is treated mainly by cognitive behavioral therapy and some anti-anxiety medications. But if we try and understand what the underlying biology of that is and the changes in immunity, we can look at that in comparison to the underlying immune dysfunction that we can see in Gulf War illness and try and tease apart what it is that belongs to Gulf War illness, what it is that belongs to post-traumatic stress disorder, and what it is when you have both of these conditions together, when you have a comorbid condition. The second way of subtyping is based on sex. As well, we've heard from Dr. Surratt that we have this sexual dimorphic difference in human beings owing to the difference in the endocrine systems of individuals. Now, going back to the illness, because it's a multi-symptom illness, multi-symptom illness is all over the body. We're talking about stuff that's going on in the brain, stuff that's going on in the gastrointestinal system, stuff that's going on with your endocrine system, with your immune system, with joints and so forth. Is if you're looking at multiple symptoms, you're looking at multiple systems within the body. Now, classic textbooks in medicine tend to break these systems up for ease of understanding them. So you may get a chapter on the brain and the nervous system, a chapter on immunity, a chapter on cardiovascular health. But these things really are not separate. They're all interconnected with one another. And there's a vast amount of crosstalk across these systems. Primarily, what we look at is the neuroendocrine immune system. So the way that the brain talks to your endocrine system through things like your fight or flight axis, the HPA axis, or the sex axis, your HPG axis, and how those things interact with your immune system. So you have your peripheral immune system, which is throughout the body, and then you have a neuroinflammatory or neuroimmune system within your brain, and those are separated by the blood-brain barrier. But they can communicate back and forth across that blood-brain barrier and with the endocrine system. So you have this tightly knit system going back and forth that you have to look at everything. Now, if you have a different endocrine system, so you have men versus women, the way that those endocrine systems interact with the immune system is going to be different. And so if you're affecting the immune system by some agent such as sarin or through something like a traumatic event and ramping up your cortisol levels and changing your immunity in response to that traumatic event, it's going to be different in men versus women. So we need to look at these things, these subgroups separately to try and tease apart not only what the effect of post-traumatic stress disorder is on Gulf War illness, but also what the effect of sex differences is on Gulf War illness. So in this study, this is a dual study that I have that's funded by the Department of Defense, the Gulf War Illness Research Program through the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program. They awarded me 2 awards, one to look at men, one to look at women, in order to tease apart the effect of post-traumatic stress disorder on Gulf War illness. We hypothesized that post-traumatic stress disorder is going to alter the way that immunity is affected within Gulf War illness. And furthermore, we hypothesized that due to sex differences that you're going to get a different presentation between men and women across these immune mechanisms. So what we did is at the Institute for Neuroimmune Medicine, we have an ongoing Gulf War illness research program where we received multiple awards over the years. And through those multiple awards, we've taken many, many assays and many, many measures of both men and women vets with Gulf War illness and without, and we've stockpiled them so that we have vast amounts of data that we've now compiled to do a secondary analysis on. So we've taken that data, grouped it together, gone through it, pulled out individuals that meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as those individuals that don't meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and then separated them by gender, and then compared their immune profiles and their psychometric profiles. So this is our cohort. It's primarily been recruited through the Climas Clinic down at the Miami Veterans Affairs Hospital. And this is kind of the breakdown. For the most part, the majority of the people that we see through the clinic are men. The military is primarily male dominated, with a fraction of the returning vets coming back having this meeting criteria for Gulf War illness. It's similar for women, but because there's initially a smaller cohort of women going over to war, it's a smaller cohort coming back, so they're much harder to find within this study. It's broken down. Most of the trauma for men has been reported as a military trauma, whereas for women, it's tended not to be reported. In further subsequent to this study, we found that it tends to be a high degree of sexual trauma outside and within the military. The first thing that we did, we wanted to see what is the effect of trauma on symptom presentation. So how does trauma gradate your ability to report on feelings of fatigue, your overall general health, your cognitive function, your mental fatigue, the role that you play, that physicality plays in your daily life, or your emotionality plays in daily life, and so forth. So we use these measures called the RAND-SF short form 36 health assay or health outcomes measures, or the multidimensional fatigue inventory, the MFI. And so what we found overall is, after accounting for age and BMI in men, we found a gross difference between our cohort, our healthy controls, and the ill people with Gulf War illness in the male group. Those with Gulf War illness tended to be heavier. They tended to be and a little bit older than the control group. So we account for that in a model, and then continue to regress the model based on Gulf War illness health status, and then upon the Davidson Trauma Score, which is a 17-point measurement scale to assess the degree a traumatic event has affected your life. Usually with a value of Davidson Trauma Score total of 70 or above in the military, that's taken to mean a high probability of having PTSD. So what we found overall is that the prime predictor for the increase in these measures is the Gulf War illness health status. So primarily, what is driving the certification of these problems in general health and energy and fatigue and so forth is the fact that you have Gulf War illness. But that if you also have PTSD or meet the criteria for PTSD, that this further enhances the degree to which you're reporting these negative health outcomes. For women, we found the same. We did not find the same difference in the age and BMI within the groups, so we didn't account for that in the model. But again, looking at the Gulf War illness status, primarily the negative reporting of these health outcomes is driven by your Gulf War illness health status, and then adding on top of that your traumatic exposure, your traumatic event that further enhances the problems within your health reporting. This is a little bit easier to understand. If we look at comparison just of two groups, or so now subtyping, moving from just a scaled continuous comparison of trauma on Gulf War illness health status, if we make a cut point, if we take that Davidson Trauma Score and say anyone that has a value of 70 and above, say that they are PTSD probable, and then call that a group of Gulf War illness high or Gulf War illness PTSD plus, and then make a separate group that if you have a Davidson Trauma Score of 70 or below, and call that a low trauma group or a PTSD negative group, and then compare these health measures. For the most part, you can see across the board that all the measures in the Gulf War illness high group or the PTSD positive group are greater than that for the low trauma group. It reaches levels of statistical significance in things like social functioning, the role that your emotions play in your daily life, your emotional well-being, your general fatigue, and your mental fatigue overall in men. Okay, so primarily this is not something that is unexpected. These are things that you would associate with something along the lines of post-traumatic stress disorder. not going out as much, having higher degree of emotionality, especially when you're exposed to something that's a triggering event and so forth. We find a similar profile for women, in addition to the fact that they're reporting increased levels of fatigue along with increased levels of trauma. Now, if we move on to the actual biological measures, for men, what we find is that across the board, there's several significant differences, and these are different for the low trauma group versus the high trauma group. So these are presentations of immune cytokines, so immune signaling molecules, as well as counts of immune cells within the blood. And it's all normalized to healthy controls. So healthy controls would be at a value of 1 across here. So for pro-inflammatory cytokine IL-1B, we can see that for the low trauma group, you have that pro-inflammatory cytokine being much lower than it is in the healthy control group. Whereas for something like IL-8, we have a large degree being increased in the high trauma group. And so we see this different response for several of these measures between the low trauma group and the high trauma group. However, for some measures such as CD2 plus and this CD3 minus CD56 plus measure, these are immune cells that are associated with either T cell or natural killer cells. And these are the same for both of the illness groups. Now, it's been purported by the Climas Clinic and the group of Dr. Marianne Fletcher for a period of time now that in Gulf War illness as well as in chronic fatigue syndrome, that the prime driver of these illnesses is dysfunctional NK cell activity. And so we do see that here. However, for some of the other measures of NK cell activity like CD3 minus, 16 plus, or 11A plus, we only see this in one of the illness groups. Additionally, a signaling molecule that is associated with NK cell function, IL-15, is only seen in the low trauma group. So we're seeing some things that are attributed to both high and low trauma groups, and some things that are attributed only to one group or the other. And this is what we're further looking into as a subtyping mechanism for high versus low trauma in males. Now, if we look over at females, again, we get differences, but there are some similarities between males and females. So your differences in IL-15 are the same, as well as for some of the measures for NK and cell activity, such as the CD3 minus and CD2 plus measures. But again, now we have something completely different that we do not see in men, differences in IL-17 signaling and TNF beta signaling. And so what this is indicative of is something that's different in the underlying immune function that's going on in the system. Now, I haven't discussed it here, but we have done modeling of these groups. We have models of the combined neuroendocrine immune system for both men and women. And if you look at the difference in the way that these regulatory systems respond to a stressor, you can find that certain behaviors that are available to all behaviors that are available to men are available to women. Okay, so that was the first finding in our models. The other thing is that beyond the normal behavior that is attributed to men and women have additional responses that are not available to men due to the way that the endocrine system can regulate immunity. So because of the biphasic nature of the way that estrogen and progesterone can affect the hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis, in some ways it can resemble what is going on in the male system, but because the polarity of that can change during the ovulatory cycle, then you're going to get changes in the way that the neuroendocrine immune system changes over time. And that is not available to the male system. So we think that this is what we're picking up here in some of the measures. And we're further going on and trying to use this now with the modeling procedures in order to predict not only PTSD, high trauma versus low trauma specific treatment courses, but men versus women specific treatment courses. So overall, the comorbid conditions of Gulf War illness and post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder tends to worsen all symptom outcomes. These are detrimental effects, but primarily seen in things that you would attribute to post-traumatic stress disorder: social, emotional, mental performance. And in the case of women, you also get that with your energy or vitality levels. Addressing just the symptoms of PTSD in these groups, in both men and women, may alleviate a lot of these problems. So not only if you have Gulf War illness, whether you're a man or a woman, but you also meet criteria for PTSD, it's vital in order to alleviate your symptoms of Gulf War illness, that you address the PTSD, because it's just going to exacerbate a lot of those symptoms that you're already feeling. The underlying biology within both men and women points to a commonality across Gulf War illness, regardless of PTSD status, in the natural killer cell activity. In the men, we also see changes in IL-8 versus IL-1B, depending on your PTSD status. And in women, we see that in IL-17 versus TNF-beta. So these are our potential biomarkers for these subgroups that we're further looking into. Overall, subtyping Gulf War illness with this method of either traumatic stress or sex seems to be a viable option for enhancing signal that we may be able to use as a reliable biomarker for these conditions, and therefore further study is warranted. I'd like to thank the funding provided by the CDMRP, and if anyone has any questions and they don't want to ask them now, you can always email me. Otherwise, I'll open up the floor to thank you. Dr. Tarter. Right, so we're looking at, so for the, oh yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Sturad. So the question is did we see anything with age and obesity affecting the immune measures? Additional factors, and that is something we're currently looking at. One thing that we have been doing in order to enhance the signal within the immune response is that all of these measures that we've looked at have been at rest. Now, what we tend to do is we take all of our vets and we bring them in and we put them on a graded exercise challenge, because this is a fatiguing illness. What we try to do is challenge that, and what we do is we ramp them up to max activity, so get them up to VO2 max, and then when they're at VO2 max, measure their immune response as well. It's not it's very helpful, because what it does is when it challenges the immune system under that exercise challenge, the response of the immune cells, the production of the immune cells, as well as their signaling molecules, gets vastly enhanced. And so we can pick out the signal much more strongly, and therefore find more reliable signals and more reliable biomarkers.
Hey, great talk. So my question has to do with, I was really struck by if you can treat the symptoms of PTSD, then their treatment for Gulf War illness can be better. Do you see any differences between the genders and their willingness to undergo treatment for PTSD, or even admitting that they may be suffering from some sort of pain caused from that? Because there are differences in maybe how individuals broadly and maybe genders stereotypically deal with emotional pain.
Do you have to repeat the question now? No? Okay, good. Okay. So short answer is I've never looked at that. That's not an aspect that I get into. I have found, because we've had to go through old reports and measures of their Davidson trauma score, is that for the most part, a lot of the times the question is asked, do you have, I think it's criterion A in Davidson trauma, is do you have a traumatic event that comes to mind? And a lot of times it says no, and that's left blank, but then they fill out the Davidson trauma criteria after that, just based on having been in the war, and their score is very, very high, like 90, 100, but they're not attributing it to something specific. So it gets a little bit gray there with because they don't certify a specific criterion. For the men, though, however, it was quite apparent that it was reported more often if it was a military-based trauma, whereas women it was not reported, at least in the records that we have.
Great talk.
Thank you.
I was told I was supposed to say that. Just kidding. How many cases of Gulf War syndrome versus like men versus women are there? Like, you're comparing men versus women with the syndrome, PTSD and Gulf War syndrome, but what are the numbers, women versus men?
That I'm not exactly sure. I know from the 750,000 troops that went over, about a third of them, so 250,000 troops returning, meet criteria for Gulf War illness. Of those, I don't know what the breakdown is for men versus women. Yeah. However, we have an ongoing study right now through the Miami VA, which is it's called Women versus Men. So we're recruiting women, and we're trying to get them to go through the exact same studies that we've done for men in the past. For the men, we've had been able to recruit them locally. So within the state of Florida, we can have them drive down to the Miami VA. For women, it's been very difficult. It's hard to find them. They're spread throughout the country, and we've had to go through different means and different channels to try and find these women, recruit them into the study, and then actually get them here to actually do the studies. Oh, in the studies, it's I think I had groups of 50, a group of 50 roughly for men, and a group of 40 for women. Yeah. What else? Anything online? Okay. Thank you very much.
All right, good morning. First off, I would like to thank the university and of course the wonderful Dr. Jeannie Tarter for inviting me. So today, following in line with looking at sex differences in physiological processes, I'm going to be speaking about sleep. All right, so because I'm wearing this, first and foremost, these are my own personal opinions. They do not represent those of the Army, the Department of Defense, or the federal government. So when we're talking about sex differences, bottom line up front, sex differences are apparent and they are pervasive. Sexual differentiation during embryonic development begins right away. And we definitely see sex differences across puberty and through adulthood. So given these two truths, it makes perfect sense that we see sex differences at a systems level, at the level of genes, brains, and behavior. So that being said, I am going to focus specifically on the sleep-wake system today. This is some work that I was able to do during my postdoc in Atlanta. And a lot of what we know about sex differences in sleep comes from the early work of my postdoc mentor, Dr. Katema Paul. And so what Dr. Paul found many years ago is that if you look at spontaneous sleep amounts in mice, that you see very clear sex differences. First, mice are nocturnal. And they also, we say they have spontaneous sleep because they don't have consolidated sleep periods like we see in humans. But if you happen to look at spontaneous sleep amounts using electrophysiology in mice that have intact gonads, you see very clear sex differences where female mice have significantly less sleep than male mice. Now, this is specific to the dark phase. Again, even though mice are nocturnal, they do have spontaneous sleep amounts. So you do see biphasic sleep with sleep being shown during the dark phase. But what was really interesting about the early days of this work is that as soon as these mice were gonadectomized during adulthood, all these sex differences were masked. And so it really pointed to the first key piece of evidence that there is an impact of sex steroids on sleep and wake processes. Now, as we heard from Dr. Sterrett's presentation, sex differences are extremely complicated, and it's more than just sex steroids. We also have to factor in genetic sex. And so this is one thing that I spent most of my postdoc doing, where we were manipulating genetic sex through transgenic mouse lines in order to further elucidate these differences. Now, the classic model in terms of how the testes determining gene, SRY, impacts sex differences, it's fairly straightforward. So in the presence of the SRY gene, there is normal phenotypic male development where you have the presence of testes. If the embryo does not contain the SRY gene, then the embryo develops into a phenotypic female and develops ovaries. So taking this basic 20th century model, we were able to use a mouse line that was developed by Dr. Arnold at UCLA, where you can have spontaneous deletion of the SRY gene and create really 4 unique scenarios that allow for complete separation of gonadal sex versus chromosomal sex. So what's really unique about this mouse model, it's called the 4-core genotype line, is that you can create 4 different scenarios. And 2 scenarios that are really unique is you can create XY mice that are lacking in SRY, which means they develop into phenotypic females. And then you can create mice that are XX but containing SRY, so they develop into phenotypic males. And so we were able to leverage this 4-core genotype model to then again look at sleep and wake states using electrophysiology. And then we also characterize some of the underlying neural substrates. Okay, so first and foremost, when we looked at spontaneous sleep amounts across 24-hour periods, we first focused our attention on mice with intact gonads to truly see what impact phenotypic sex had on sleep and wake behavior. So what you're seeing right here are 3 different states of sleep. You have total sleep across a 24-hour period, and then you have the division of total sleep into the 2 core sleep processes, which are non-rapid eye movement sleep and rapid eye movement sleep, shown on the bottom. We also separated out sleep between the light and dark phase because, again, mice do not have consolidated sleep periods. They sleep during both phases. And one of the key findings we found, very similar to what my postdoc mentor found in the early days, is that the phenotypic female mice were sleeping significantly less during the dark phase. So we wanted to see, again, this is in mice that had intact gonads. So of course we wanted to look if this impact persisted in the absence of gonads. And so we did the same exact experiment, this time following a gonadectomy. And yet again, we found the same exact results. So what you see here on the left is the breakdown based on genetic sex. There are absolutely no differences between the genetic males and the genetic females, either during the light phase or the dark phase. But what you do see is if you break it down by phenotypic sex, again, you see this difference where females are sleeping significantly less during the dark phase compared to the phenotypic males. So this more or less shows that the SRY gene is necessary and sufficient to explain sex differences in sleep and wake processes. Now, of course, we kind of wanted to look at this under some more real world conditions. Sleep deprivation is evident. Of course, you know, I'm in a career path where sleep deprivation is sometimes a winning prize, if you will. So we wanted to see if these differences could persist if the sleep system was homeostatically challenged. And to our surprise, many of these sex differences disappeared in the presence of sleep deprivation. But in one mouse line where we continued to see these phenotypic female sex differences are in the true females that are XX and lacking SRY. Okay, so of course, sleep, it's more than just electrophysiology. Sleep is a whole brain process. There are a significant amount of brain areas that regulate sleep at the level of the cortex, and then subcortical areas such as the hypothalamus. And so it's really important to us to take a mechanistic understanding of our sleep results. And so we did this using immunohistochemistry. One of the easiest shotgun approaches to look at differences in neuronal activity in different brain areas is to do an immunohistochemical stain of the biomarker CFOS. And so that's exactly what we did, where we basically looked at various brain areas, specifically within the hypothalamus, that regulate sleep and wake states. Now, all of us as scientists, sometimes you have that experiment where, you're a postdoc or a graduate student, and you have that one study that years later you tell your grad students and your postdoc, like, well, back in my day, I did this. So this for me was my study, because if you remember the results I showed you, we found that there were spontaneous sleep differences during the dark phase. And so in order to truly capture what neuronal activation was like in these areas of the hypothalamus during the dark phase, it basically meant that I had to sit in the dark with a red light, because mammalian species are insensitive to red light, and sit there for hours until I watched these mice fall asleep using some of the behavioral criteria for sleep, and then to sacrifice them and to stain their brains for this biomarker. So to my luck, it only took about 4 hours of sitting in the dark on multiple occasions for this to happen. But this whole process was worth it, because we did find very clear differences in a variety of hypothalamic areas of the brain. And this is just one of the representative brain areas here. What you see here is a coronal section under a microscope of the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the essential hypothalamic area responsible for generating and maintaining circadian rhythms. You can see here that there are very clear differences in the amount of neuronal activation between males and females, where females have more activation compared to males, which does lend credence to this idea of having less sleep during the dark phase, as I had shown previously. Now, what's interesting is that those differences, I should mention, disappeared under sleep deprivation. So it was very similar to what we saw under the instances of looking at sleep using electrophysiology, that sleep deprivation does indeed mask sex differences in sleep and wake processes. Now, of course, it would be remiss if we didn't take a bench to bedside approach and look at some translational studies in humans. So I did my postdoc at the Morehouse School of Medicine, which is a historically Black college and university. So a lot of our research is geared towards understanding disease states that primarily affect African Americans. And so this is exactly what we did in this study. We specifically recruited African Americans, largely from low-income areas around Atlanta, and we looked at various sex disparities in disordered sleep, and whether or not sex had a significant impact on the severity of sleep apnea. So one thing I will mention about our population is they were significantly overweight. Their BMI was, fits the criteria for morbidly obese. So that is one thing to consider, because it means that there is a great statistical likelihood that these individuals have sleep apnea. There's direct relationships between overall BMI and the severity of sleep apnea, and you can truly see this in this population here. So up top, those are the overnight sleep study readouts for the males, and on the bottom, those are the overnight sleep study readouts for the females. Two things that are worth mentioning. First and foremost, the severity of sleep apnea was significantly worse in the males compared to the females. What's interesting is typically with sleep apnea, you see these hypoxic episodes during the transition from non-REM to REM sleep. So most people who have severe sleep apnea report very low REM sleep amounts. But what's interesting about this population of males is that they also had a significant amount of hypoxic episodes during non-REM sleep itself, which truly lends credence to that there are apparent sex differences in insufficient sleep, because you see a lack of restoration, not just during REM sleep, but also non-REM sleep. What's interesting about this study is, since this time I've gone on and have done clinical research for the military, and we actually quite honestly see reverse in military populations. Some of the recent work that has been done by my colleagues at Walter Reed, we find that females actually have a higher rate of sleep disorders, particularly sleep apnea compared to males. So it does vary by demographic, and it does seem to vary by population. So this is all I have for you today. I hope by the end of this, I have convinced you that there are very clear sex differences in sleep. These are apparent not just at the level of how genetics can drive these differences, but also at the level of brain and behavior, specifically with differences most appearing in the hypothalamus. And then lastly, we do see direct translation of this work in human populations, specifically if you look at the severity of sleep apnea. So that being said, I of course would like to thank the institutes at the National Institutes of Health who have funded my work over the years. And then of course, my wonderful mentors at UCLA, Morehouse School of Medicine, and Northwestern, who have helped me do this research and most of the research in my career. So thank you. So future studies looking at sex differences. Actually, I was just talking with Katema about this last week. We really want to look more into local sleep. So local sleep is this phenomenon, for those who don't know, where various subregions of the brain can go to sleep. And so that's one thing we want to look at, is a more like subcortical electrophysiological approach.
This is the last and final talk. Dr. Tarter said she wanted to save the best for last, hence I am here. But I will actually build quite a bit. Is there an echo? This sounds echoey. Is it okay? Actually build quite a bit on Dr. Starrett's talk. In terms of athletic performance, there is actually a huge volume of real world data. A lot of this is accessible on the track and field website, et cetera, et cetera. But what I'm going to do is go over a lot more detail in terms of athletic performance. Now, my interest in athletic performance actually started a long time ago, so this will date me quite a bit. If you remember, in 1972, the old Soviet Union, Valery Bortsov won the 100 to 200. It's very difficult to double in the 1 and the 2, but he did it, and I thought, wow, this is pretty amazing. So back then, you know, a lot of guys are fascinated by strength. I was fascinated by speed. Also, some of my other favorite athletes, Muhammad Ali, formerly Cassius Clay. My father, when we immigrated from the Philippines to the United States, he immediately took a liking to watching boxing. So he would actually bring us to prize fights quite a bit. And then also I developed this interest in martial arts, and hence my interest in Bruce Lee. He was clearly one of the fast athletes as well. Now let's talk about pioneers in women's sports. If you go back to Babe Didrikson, really almost 100 years ago, she was quite the athlete. And then you go to Wilma Rudolph back in the Olympics. She was the fastest woman in the 1960s. There are a lot of women who are trailblazers in the athletic field. Now it's interesting, and for me, this seems like yesterday, but then I was thinking, wow, that's actually over 50 years ago. The first woman to run the Boston Marathon, and I wish, if you look at the picture on the top left, she's running in sweatpants and a sweatshirt. And you can barely see this old guy behind her trying to push her off the course. Women were not allowed to run the Boston. He literally was trying to physically remove her from the course. So her boyfriend, who you can see is right behind her, pushed the race director off of her. And she finished. You can see her time was 4 hours, 20 minutes. I mean, not great, but hey, anyone who finishes a marathon, it's pretty amazing. And it wasn't until 1972 that women could officially run the Boston, which, I mean, I was a child of the 70s, so to me, it seems like yesterday, but actually it's quite a long time ago. Now, this really dates me. I don't know if you remember the original battle of the sexes between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. Bobby Riggs, for those, I mean, you could YouTube this stuff. He was really more of a showman, and he challenged Billie Jean King, who was the #1 female tennis player at the time, to these tennis matches. And of course, he got killed. I mean, Billie Jean killed him. But you can say this is sort of when people started talking about, you know, male versus female differences in athletic performance. Another great athlete, Joan Benoit. She was the first female Olympian 1984 was the first year that the Olympics had a marathon. I mean, just think about that. This is funny or weird. Prior to 1984, there was a lot of people in the International Olympic Committee that did not think women should be running that far. So women have come a long way athletically. Now, I think what's even more amazing, if you look at that bottom bullet point, at 61 years of age, she ran to Boston in 3 hours and 4 minutes. That is ungodly fast. That's a 7-minute mile. And for those of you who run, like I can't run 1 mile in 7 minutes. She did it for 26.2 miles. That is insane. So we know that most world-class women can beat most men and women. Most world-class women can beat most of humanity. However, size does matter. And this is sort of takes off a little bit on what Dr. Starrett had mentioned. I'm going to show you a little bit of data that we've collected from, we get a lot of athletes going through our lab, and you'll see there are stark sex differences just on size alone. For instance, look at this. Height. There are a few male athletes that are quite short, but if you look, there's a pretty clear demarcation in terms of height. You look at weight. You have males that are up to 140 kilos. You're not going to find a female that's 140 kilos. I mean, it just doesn't exist. And you can see most of the female athletes are down at the lower end. Not much overlap at all. I can't see the left side of this. What's it? Oh, body mass. All right, and if you look here, body mass, again, not much overlap. Percent body fat, you can see even males as a percentage of body weight have much lower percent body fat. And then this must be fat mass. I think it's fat mass. Okay, it's like part of it is cut off on the slides. If you look at fat mass, you can see it's even, more or less, but of course, males have a larger total mass. But this is the killer. When you look at lean body mass or fat-free mass, males have much more fat-free mass or lean body mass. And in fact, again, the caveat here, these are athletic, this is an athletic population, this isn't general population. So when you're looking at athletes, the differences become even more stark. And then this is bone mineral density. This is one of those things that if you look at male athletes versus female athletes are high. I mean, you're probably not used to looking at these values, but 1.2 grams per centimeter squared is high. Males, they're up to 1.6 grams per centimeter squared. So males on average, these are male athletes, have much denser bones. And for a lot of sports, especially collision sports, clearly that's an advantage. Now, what about the cardiovascular system? There have been people making claims that perhaps in the endurance sports, that's where women might be able to sort of narrow the male advantage. But if you look at the classic measure of cardiovascular capacity or cardiovascular power, elite females, their max VO2 can maybe reach 70 milliliters per kilogram per minute. Elite males, a lot of them exceed 80, which is pretty high. However, I got to put this up there because I love comparative physiology. Dogs are actually much higher than people. And that's why if you have a fat beagle, he will still outrun you because dogs have a high VO2 max, even if they're untrained. They're just aerobic creatures. Now, for comparison, Lance Armstrong's max VO2 was about 85 mLs per kg per minute. I don't think there's any elite female athlete that's in the 80s. I think they sort of top off at 70. And that's because if you compare male versus female and you look at cardiovascular system, the male heart is larger relative to the body. They have more red blood cells. They have higher hematocrit. They have greater lung capacity. So those differences you just can't erase. Now, if you look at the sort of divergence, for those people who have young kids and you sort of follow them as they compete in athletics, there's the divergence in terms of sex or gender and athletic performance starts at around age 12 to 13. That's when you start to see this. And people tend to feel like it's mostly related to the increase in plasma testosterone. But again, there are a lot of advantages just in terms of normal bone structure that men will typically have an advantage athletically over women. So what I've done here is this is real world data in terms of athletic performance. And I've picked track and field or running events. And why do I pick running? Well, can't pick baseball or softball because you need a field, you need bat, you need gloves. You can't pick any sport that requires equipment, but you can pick running because it doesn't matter what country you live in, anyone can run, right? So what do we see here? And I've focused on the 100 because the 100-meter dash is typically, well, who's the fastest person? Get on the track, run as fast as you can. Also pick the 400 here because what's the 400? It's one lap around the track. I mean, most of us can run one lap around the track, right? And you can see that by age 15, high school boys can beat the fastest women of all time by age 15 in the 100. In the 400, by age 14, high school boys can beat the fastest women of all time. What about middle distance? By age 14 to 800, 2 laps around the track, 14-year-old boys can beat the fastest women of all time. By age 15, the mile, the fastest high school boy can beat the fastest women of all time. Now, when you get into long distance events, you'll notice here the marathon, you don't have any high school kids beating female marathon runners, and that's because there's no marathon distance in high school. In fact, if you're a cross-country runner, I don't think there's a single coach who would ever recommend you run a marathon in high school. But if you look at the 5,000 and 10,000, you'll notice by age 15 and 16, high school boys are beating the fastest women in the world. Now, the field events, most of you, unless you watch the Olympics a lot or watch track and field a lot, you're probably not familiar with these field events, so I decided to put some really cool pictures because these are actually very beautiful events. Watch this, Dr. Brager. In the high jump, boys by the age of 14 are already beating world-class women. In the pole vault, which is a beautiful event, you're running full speed, you have a pole, you put it in a hole, you fly. I mean, what a cool event. By age 15, boys are beating world-class women. The long jump, by age 15, boys are beating world-class women. What about the triple jump? By age 15, boys are beating world-class women. Shot put, by age 15, boys are already stronger than the strongest women in the world. Now, what's interesting about the shot, and I know no one here, I'm a big fan of track and field. The weight of the shot for women, I think, is 10 pounds. The weight of the shot for high school boys is 12 pounds. The weight for the shot for adult men is 16 pounds. So they're already moving a larger object farther than the strongest women. And the discus, by age 15, boys are beating world-class women. Hammer throw, another cool event. Boys are beating world-class women by age 14. So really by age 14, 15, you're already seeing this divergence in athletic performance. Javelin, which another cool event, just don't get hit by it. Boys are beating world-class women by age 14. Now, when you look at track, there is a consistent 10% difference between world-class male and world-class female athletes. So I highlighted here the 100-meter dash and the 1-mile time run. You'll notice that in the 100, the world-class record for adult men is 9.58. That's Usain Bolt. 10.49. I'll show you who the world-class holder for that is. You look at the mile, you know, there's that vaunted sub-4-minute mile that Roger Bannister did in 1954, I believe. Not a single female has broken the 4-minute mile, but high school boys routinely do it. And you can see the American high school record is 3:53. I think it might even be lower now. Whereas the fastest woman in the world is about a 4:12, which is still really fast. Now, I don't know if anyone watched the 1988 Olympics besides me, but I loved watching FloJo. Not only was she fast, she was one of the few people who knew how to market herself. She wore these really crazy cool outfits, and she still holds the world record, 10.49, which, by the way, is a lot faster than Sha'Carri Richardson. I mean, we're all talking about Sha'Carri Richardson because she was caught smoking pot and she can't compete, but Sha'Carri Richardson has the second fastest time, and she still would be killed by FloJo. However, what's interesting about FloJo is she couldn't crack the top 25 of high school boys on any given year. And Sha'Carri Richardson, second fastest of all time, there are 9 high school boys in Florida alone that are faster than her. In fact, South Florida, something weird about South Florida. If you go to South Florida high schools, there are boys there that are already running faster than every female on the planet. This is just South Florida. So, you guys know Usain Bolt. It'll be tough to break that record. Matt Bowling holds the high school record. So I would highly recommend, if you like track, watch the Olympics, because the United States may actually sweep the 100 and the 200. And I can't even remember if they've ever done that. Right now, the best sprinters in the world are in this country. It'll be amazing to watch. Now, this is a question that always comes up. Do women have an advantage, though, when you start making the events super long, ultra distance stuff, greater than 26.2 miles? And to me, 26.2 miles is kind of ultra to me. I'm like, God, that's a long time to run. But it has to exceed 26 miles, right? So the world's toughest foot race. It's called the Badwater 135. It is 135 miles of running. 135 miles of running. Valerie looks like she wants to do it. Temperatures exceeding 130 degrees Fahrenheit. It is so hot, you know it, that they run on the white line because your shoes will melt, right? So they're literally staring at the white line, running on it, shoes melt. There are no aid stations, so you're like, well, you got to get water, right? So you actually have your own crew in a van following you for 135 miles. It's a crazy race, right? For ultramarathoners, it is the toughest race of all, right? Well, what's the course record? Imagine running for 21 hours and 33 minutes, which, by the way, if you do the math, he's running at a pretty good clip. And actually, even for the female record, she's running at a good clip. This is not like, you know, a slow jog. This is, they're maintaining a good pace. But even with ultra distance stuff, men still outcompete women. Now, people say, well, women are better at oxidizing fat, which is true. Men are better at oxidizing carbs, which is true. However, you still have to overcome all the other advantages, all the other male advantages. Greater cardiac output, greater stroke volume, greater lung capacity, et cetera, et cetera. So even, what's interesting about ultra distance, if you follow the ultra distance community, some women will actually win races outright. They still will. But it might be because so few people are crazy enough to do this. It's like, okay, who really wants to run 135 miles? You're talking about a very select group of people who mentally are like, yeah, I can run 135 miles, right? So, but here's what I want to do. I want to put this a female athletic performance in perspective, right? Because you got to compare it to something. And for those of you who remember cigarette ads, which I do, this was a Virginia Slims ad. Apparently, it was okay for women to smoke cigarettes. So they said, hey, you've come a long way, baby. So we can use the same sort of ad campaign for athletic performance in women, right? Because they've come a long way. Now, one of my good friends, Sandra Frenuyl, she's 50 years old. And I like this caption, some people are just better, because some people are just better, right? She's 50 years old, and she is beating college-age women. This was a track meet March 28th of this year at University of Miami. She finished 4th. She's beating 18 to 21-year-old women. And my wife ran track, Division I track at Drake University. Her and her friends are like, they can't believe she's doing this. Like, no one can believe she's doing this. She's 50 years old. She's running at a crazy fast pace. In this particular race, she ran the equivalent of a 5:01 mile. For those of you who run, you're like, that's great. That's just crazy fast, crazy fast. Now, my wife competes in duathlon events, run, bike, run. This is a Turtleman duathlon, and she won it outright. You can see her time. She's a lot faster than the second place person who's a guy. And I don't know if you follow the endurance world, but there's a term that women will use when they beat a guy. They say, you've been chipped. And these girls, they hate the guys, when they get past, they absolutely hate it. And so in local races, when you get to the local level, women will beat men. In fact, my wife wins a lot of these races outright. But once you get to the national level, there's a separation. Men beat women. And once you get to the world-class level, then it's not even close. But at the local level, you will see this. You will see this. So you can train, I always say the best women in the world will still beat most of humanity, but the best women in the world will never get close to beating the best men, right? Now, a lot of you may or may not know that I used to be the head coach of a travel softball team. My wife was a general manager. This was our team. This is when they were 12 and under. Arrows are pointing to my daughters. I had one daughter that was a pitcher, the other was a catcher. The woman in the middle, her name's Stacy Wilson. She's a 1996 Olympic gold medalist in soccer. I think that's when they beat China. And she used to come on occasion to train the kids. And we always said, we train you guys better than college coaches train you because, well, we do. And we had this annual event where we went to the Deerfield Beach baseball team's head coach said, hey, let's have a scrimmage. The girls play the guys, right? But it was in softball, not baseball. So we already knew it was rigged because if you're a baseball player, you're not used to seeing a ball travel from a hand, the release where it's at the bottom, and then the ball rises. Baseball players are used to the ball coming from up here and coming down. So in this particular one, this is 2012, we beat the boys 10-0. And we beat them every year, like 10-0, 12-0, 9-0. And the boys would get all pissed off. They're like, oh my God, girls are beating us. Well, I mean, in a way, if you let the boys maybe practice softball, they know how to hit a ball that rises instead of drops. But it goes to show you that female athletic performance is at a very high level. And actually, having coached and been part of softball for 8 years, I can tell you softball is a much more fun game to watch than baseball. It's not even close. Softball is a much faster game. And a lot of people don't realize that. They're like, no, baseball, no, softball's a lot better. But anyway, so this is an example of high-level female athletic performance. And I always say, if you have kids, start training them young. These are my kids when they were little. We would take them out to the field, and we'd have them do ladder drills, parachute sprints, box jumps, med ball throws. Now, we never said, hey, we're going to go out in the field and train you. We just said, hey, let's go out in the field, and we're going to play and do stuff. And I remember when we used to visit their grandparents in Iowa, we would say, hey, okay, we got to go to the school, and we're going to do sprints. And so we'd go to the local elementary school, we'd find a hill, and we're going to do hill sprints. And later when they got into high school, they realized, nobody does this. No parents bring their kids to a hill and make them do hill sprints. We were the only ones. I'm like, yeah, but you thought it was normal at the time, right? Doing hill sprints on a vacation. So from a very young age, they learned the value of movement. And to them, it's normal now. They're like, oh, okay, well, you just work out. That's just what you do. Even though one of them hated it, complained every day. And now she just does it on her own. I just told my wife, don't worry, let her complain every day. When she's an adult, she will realize how valuable exercise is, and she does it on her own. And so, in summary, there's a profound male advantage in athletic performance. Number one, world-class women will beat the majority of men and women. World-class men are typically 10% faster than women in all distances. 15 years of age is a magic number. Typically, by age 15, boys will outperform every female on the planet if they train. Again, this is the best. These are the best boys. So elite high school boys by age 15 are faster than women, world-class women. And last bullet point, just sort of my advice to you, when your kids can walk, start training them. And these are my references. Thank you very much. I'll take any questions, comments. Yes. Well, I think there's two things that are going on. One, I don't think it was tearing down female athletes. In fact, I thought it was celebrating female athletes. In fact, I show my own girls here. Two, there are people in this world who actually don't think boys and girls are different. So I made that point obvious because there are a lot of people who think men and women are interchangeable, right? And they're not interchangeable. particularly in athletics. In fact, the two biggest differences in humans are sex and age. So why do we have categories in athletics of male and female? Because men and women are different. Why do we have age groups? Because age matters. Young people are better than old people. That's why it's important. And here's what's interesting. If someone had said, do this talk 10 years ago, I'd be like, why? This is sort of like saying water is wet. But today, there are people who don't think men and women are different. And that is insanity. That is total insanity. So that's why, I think that's why this talk's important. Yes. Okay, the question is, okay, this will be the last question because we're out of time. Has to do with transgender athletes. If you're dealing with trans men, so these are female to male transition, I don't think anyone has a problem. In fact, you don't see any trans men, meaning women to men, doing well in athletic performance. However, when you're dealing with trans females, so these are males to females, biological males to females, I think the particular case you're referring to is Laurel Hubbard, New Zealand weightlifter. A male since age 35. So think about this. Age 35, she's got testosterone coursing through her body from age 12, so for all those years. And then at age 35, she transitions, right? Those advantages in terms of the strength and power don't suddenly disappear. Now, I guess the question is it fair to other female athletes? I don't think it is. Because, in fact, this is the analogy. If you're on anabolic steroids as a male, so now we're just dealing with males, you're banned. It's a 4-year ban. Why? Because anabolic steroids confer a performance advantage. But now you're dealing with an individual who's literally been on it for 15 to 20 years. Technically, that should be a 4-year ban. So if men are banned for using androgens, why would that not apply to the trans female athlete who's been on natural androgens for literally most of their life? So I think we'll see in this Olympics what happens, but in weightlifting and in speed sports, I don't know if you can completely eliminate those male and female distinctions. I don't think it'll happen.
So it's funny. Did you hear at some point about size matters?
Carlos is 6'2".
And I am standing. Hold on to this because I got
Okay. Again, we just really want to thank all the speakers today. This was so amazing, and it was great to learn about sex differences and how that can apply to so many different things, from sleep to athletic performance to health. So we really can't thank you enough. We'd love to thank our virtual audience. We're so excited to have had you here. But we do have some special thank yous for our speakers today.
So I was making a little bit of a joke, but it is true because we have an example of the fact that I am shorter. And quite frankly, I'll say to you that as far as sports, as a male, I heard things like, you throw like a girl, and some really harsh statements. And I think that as we are, because of distancing, we are in the health professions division. And a great motto that they use is do no harm. And I think that we need to keep that in mind, especially with young people. But you are much better at tossing than I am. So please keep that in mind when, especially with working with young people, because often we call girls pretty and we call boys strong. And I think that we should always encourage people to be whoever they want to be. So thank you to all our presenters, and thank you for joining us.